Shabbat Shalom. Think with me for a moment about repetition. When events seem to recur over and over in your life, why does that happen? What is the point of repetition? Perhaps we can learn something from it. Perhaps it's because we all have our patterns, for better or for worse. And sometimes we come to our next experience with a new perspective. Right? If you can think about these times in your life when you feel like, oh, I'm back in that pattern. It happened again. The same thing that happened last week or a year ago or 10 years ago. Here I am back again. Sometimes we've learned something from it. Sometimes we come to it with a new perspective, and sometimes we don't. So this morning we started the book of Deuteronomy, and I asked you before we started reading Torah to pay close attention in the text, especially in the first chapter of Deuteronomy, for repetitions. Times when we read a story that we've already read before. The whole book of Deuteronomy is full of repetitions because this is Moses' final speech to the Israelites, and he's recounting what has happened in the past. But we only have one book of the Torah here, Deuteronomy, so we can't recount absolutely every detail, starting from Genesis. So what comes back up? What is repeated? Ross has a microphone, I think, and I'll ask you to raise your hand if you have an answer. Did you see anything in this parsha that we've already read about? What did you find? And if you found something, tell us why you think that particular story or piece was repeated. Boris.
In this particular instance, you see a recapitulation, what Moses is remembering for what happened, and to a certain extent is his interpretation or what happened then.
Great, okay,
and it's
so
40 years later.
Right, so we're looking at a later time period, and he's giving his own interpretation, which we all do. If you saw some event and then you were later telling a friend about it, it would be through your eyes, right? Your interpretation, your perspective. Great. So did anyone notice? Give me a specific example, something you noticed. All right, we have Howie over here. A specific example, something that we've read before in the Torah and that you see repeated in this week's Parsha.
The organization of all the lieutenants and colonels and the whole deal, people who should take the burden off of Moshe, because originally the reference back is to when his father-in-law Yitro came along and said, you can't do all this, man. You're going to get wiped out. Make sure you organize a whole crew of assistants to handle all these legal matters that you have to handle every day from morning to night. You don't get a chance now to do anything else.
Correct. So Howie, before you give up the mic, I'll put you on the spot for a second because I think that's a great example. The appointment of judges, magistrates, sort of setting up a legal system so that Moses won't be overwhelmed with answering every single question himself and adjudicating every case himself. So the question is, why does that need to be repeated? What's worthy of repetition about that story?
I think there's much more detail here. Number one, he says that first you need somebody for the thousands, and then the hundreds, and then the this. So it shows, I think, that either they did or didn't do this. That is this whole reorganization detail. Did it really ever happen?
Great, thank you. So sometimes we repeat something because we didn't fully learn our lesson the first time, and it's a repetition to say, hey, you were supposed to do this, and you didn't. Sometimes it's to pat ourselves on the back, to say, this was a moment where we had to have a full reorganization of our legal system, and look at us, we did it. We should be proud. Great, okay. Other examples that you noticed. Something else in the text that was repeated, that we read previously. Okay, in the back. Ross, will you bring the microphone?
We are reminded of how the Reubenites and Gadites went to Moses and said, we want that land over there.
Great. Okay, so in terms of the journey through the desert, the full journey and where they end up. Great. Okay. Anything else that you noticed repeated? Did anyone notice Howie's ready for another answer, but all right, we won't make you do all the work today. Did anyone notice that we don't get the full story of the spies repeated, but, oh, Michael, were you going to say that? You doubted yourself.
Because I didn't see it here, but in the original thing, God says to Moses, send out the spies, and later on, they're accusing him of sending it, doing it all on his own.
Right. So we don't get a full repetition of the story, but similar to what Boris said earlier, right? It's always filtered through, now we're getting Moses' perspective on the story, his interpretation, but it is repeated in a certain way. It's sort of called back to. Michael.
One thing I've learned from reading, and I used to doubt it all the time, in Deuteronomy from all the previous things, is the justification of why God does not let Moses go over the promised land. Because
Right.
it is not just telling the story different. It's he's losing it, his anger, and he can't
Right.
control a lot of it. So it's time to step aside.
Right. So let's focus for a moment on the story of the spies, which, like I said, it's not that we get an entire repetition of that story this week, but we get a little callback to it. This is something we read not a very long time ago, but several weeks ago. One person from each tribe, 12 spies, were sent to go check out the promised land and report back what they saw. And they report that there were giants, and we can't overtake them. And that's why the Israelites can't immediately go and enter the land at that time. So, like I said, we just recently read that story in the Torah. Why would we repeat it? Why do you think we might repeat the story of the spies? For those who remember what the story is? Because, say it again, Boris? For exceptions? Oh, that's true. Yes, there are of the 12, there are 10 who give this report that there are giants, and 2 who say, actually, the promised land is inhabitable and we can take it over. We repeat it perhaps because we made a mistake. The story of the spies is a huge mistake. Think about how much earlier we could have entered the promised land. That faith we could have shown. But we didn't. A major mistake was made. We can't ignore it. We have to repeat the story until we learn from what happened. And I think that happens in our own lives. Sometimes we have to relive our mistakes until we learn from what happened. So this Parsha, Dvarim, we always read at this time of year leading up to Tisha B'Av, the commemoration of the destruction of the temple, which begins tonight. This is the time of year when we remember the terrible tragedies that have befallen the Jewish people over and over again on Tisha B'Av and the period leading up to it. So we know about the destruction of the first temple by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. That's the first instance of Tisha B'Av. The destruction of the second temple by the Romans in 70 CE. And keep in mind when we talk about the temple, this is not a temple like Park Avenue Synagogue where, God forbid, something should happen. There are lots and lots of synagogues and centers of worship. This is the temple, capital T, temple. This is the center point of community, the place where people felt God's presence. This loss of a temple, it wasn't just a loss of a building. It was a loss of their entire mode of connecting to God and to community. So keep that in mind when we think about the depth of tragedy on Tisha B'Av. Later on in the 13th century, the expulsion of Jews from England. In the 15th century, expulsion of Jews from Spain. Massacres connected with the Crusades happened on Tisha B'Av. We use this date as a sort of catch-all, but it's also because we believe that a lot of these terrible things that happened to the Jewish people happened on this date and in this season of the year. So many tragedies. And because of the terrible tragedies that happen to our people over and over and over and over again at this time of year, we're actually supposed to start decreasing our joy the moment that Av begins, the Hebrew month of Av, on Rosh Chodesh Av, which was last Shabbat. And often that's hard. It's hard to just force ourselves to be sad, or to be any emotion for that matter, on command. We have to force ourselves to conjure up our own experiences of brokenness in order to relate. But sometimes it's easy to relate. Within the first few days of the month of Av this year, in Midtown, mere blocks away from our neighborhood, there was a violent shooting. 4 innocent lives taken, 1 innocent person injured, and 2 of those victims, Wesley LePatner and Julia Hyman, were closely connected to our PAS community. So in this moment, it's not hard to put ourselves in the frame of mind of tragedy and loss. It's not hard to decrease our joy. We don't have to force our hearts to break. They are already broken. And it's also not hard for us to understand this concept of repetition from our Parsha, the idea that we make the same mistakes over and over again. This particular shooting feels personal because of its proximity and victims, but we read about shootings all over this country all the time, over and over and over again. Rabbi Alan Liu, a rabbi in San Francisco, writes that the message of Tisha B'Av can be taken in 2 ways. The way we usually think about Tisha B'Av and the period leading up to it is that it's a sort of cursed time. There's something eerie going on, which is why terrible things have happened to us. That's why, for example, we traditionally don't have weddings during this period. Rabbi Liu says the second way to think about Tisha B'Av is a time when we are reminded that catastrophes will keep recurring until we get things right, until we learn what we need to learn from them. History repeats itself, especially on Tisha B'Av, and today we read a parsha that begins our repetition of what has come before. Tisha B'Av falls exactly 7 weeks before Rosh Hashanah. And that means it's time to start thinking about teshuvah, repentance. Teshuvah is a very personal process. And when we think about repetition, I'm sure we can all think about patterns in our own lives, events that keep on happening to us. But deep down, we know that we are continuing some unhealthy pattern that allows whatever it is to happen. But teshuvah doesn't have to be just personal. Sometimes we have to think about national teshuvah, societal teshuvah, communal teshuvah. We have to think about the events that keep happening over and over and over again, like the shootings that have plagued our country for years and have only increased in frequency in recent times. The lesson of Dvarim and Tisha B'Av is this: history repeats itself until we don't let it. Mass shootings will not stop until we figure out how to make laws that keep us safe. Patterns don't stop until we stop them. Often when a shooting happens, we are all outraged, we cry out, we get angry, we want action. And then a week goes by, and another week, and another week, and we're on to the next thing. We forget. We forget even though we haven't solved the problem. So another shooting happens and the same pattern repeats. This Tisha B'Av, let us stay focused on our patterns, our personal patterns and our societal patterns. Let us stay laser focused until we can end the pattern. Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you for joining the Park Avenue Synagogue family. I hope you enjoyed the sermon. Please consider supporting our online community by scanning the QR code or by going to support pas.org, or by making a donation. Shalom, and see you in shul.